Welcome to Hacked in the Dark, the premier podcast network featuring Forged in the Dark games and their designers. I'm here today with the designer of Mountain Home, a new Forged in the Dark game about dwarves and their journey through the mountain unknown.
Hi, I'm Karl. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm the designer of Mountain Home.
Excellent. And I also have with me a co-host who I'm very glad to bring back. They're a returning cast member from one of our previous shows, actual play show ECB.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, my name is Erik Saltwell. My pronouns are he, him, and I design games with a group called Cryptic Cabal.
Fantastic. And I'm very glad to have both of you on here, but I'm especially keen to get to talk to Karl about their game, which has really only recently been available to the public. It's quite the new development. You've been hanging very close to your work for so long, and many of us have been waiting patiently, and we're excited to see something, even the ashcan version of your game, which was recently dropped.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm really excited to talk to you about your background and find out more about, what makes you tick a little bit, what gets you out here in this space.
So I've been in the kind of indie RPG community for probably a good 6-7 years. I became really involved in the hobby when I found myself on a Slack community called RPG Talk, and it eventually moved over to Discord, but it got me involved with a lot of designers working on indie projects of their own. I was able to see people starting to build games and really brought the hackability of games to the forefront in my mind, and I've started, working on games and bringing projects into fruition. And Mountain Home has kind of been my dream project to work on for a long time, where I've been sitting on the idea in the back of my head, and eventually I played Blades in the Dark and I kind of realized it clicked. This is the perfect system for me to implement my dream of Mountain Home. And so I started getting to work.
I just want to say before we get started that the cover art on Mountain Home is absolutely gorgeous. It made me super, super jealous. Just delicious.
Yeah, my wife actually drew it, and she doesn't think of herself as much of an artist, except she nailed the cover and it draws everyone in, and she did a phenomenal job.
Seriously, Congratulations. Make sure that you convey that to her, because it was phenomenal.
Yes.
Yeah, she's a natural.
I make sure that she hears every single compliment about the cover, because they're so thorough and so warm and generous.
Yeah.
And to think that she wasn't thinking it was that good. Wow. Some artists have trouble putting forth their work when they think it's good.
Yeah. I think the only reason why I convinced her to do it is that I conceived of this release of Mountain Home as an ashcan, which is that sort of indie RPG term for a low or no art, kind of rough around the edges, but totally playable game. And so that's kind of the state that Mountain Home is in right now, where I think it's playable, I think you'll enjoy reading it, but it's not perfect, and I'm slowly getting to that point.
Now let's talk a little bit about, as you're developing it, this was born from some sort of a love for a certain particular franchise of game or line of game, right?
Admittedly, this game originally came up as, my love of Dwarf Fortress in particular, which is a computer game that's about going out into the mountains as a group of dwarves and trying to make your settlement succeed. It's notoriously difficult to play. It's notoriously deadly. And every time people play it, they tend to write these stories that fill the gaps between what you're seeing on your screen and kind of, what your imagination is doing. And I've always wanted to have a role-playing game that does the same thing. It fills the void between just, statistics and dwarves and success or failure and, politics with your neighbors and, dwarves going out of the settlement to deal with things. And, I really wanted to be able to make that narrative thorough and with my friends.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. I think that's the biggest draw that I've seen from the heartfelt community, that they're able to have more than just a Dwarf Fortress simulation going on in front of them. They're able to find a lot more enjoyment out of those stories by adding their own depth,
I like to call Mountain Home my love letter to Dwarf Fortress, because I've tried hard not to just copy it, and instead I've tried to extrapolate and kind of expand into, the imagined potential of building these places.
Yeah, if you think about it, it's really a gateway, a really great gateway drug, so to speak, and it's a good one, to role-playing as a hobby, because, you've got a lot of the mechanisms handled for you by the computer game. And so if we simplify that stuff and allow you to create your own stories, imagine what you could create, Yeah.
And that's actually one of the things that I love about the Forged in the Dark framework, where I realized that John Harper did some very smart decisions about abstraction, where money doesn't matter until it does, and then it's just coin. Or, the cops being on you doesn't matter until the entanglement table happens, and then it's a huge deal. And I think that sort of genius about keeping the players not involved in moving coins around and counting how many stones they've got ready, and instead focusing on characters and what their settlement needs and how their neighbors feel, is kind of the magic of the system.
Is this something that you find your team also shares with you, this vision, this understanding about that vision and how it might transport into this Mountain Home game?
So my team is basically just me. Got my wife as an artist and me as the designer. I've had a couple of people on board doing some editing for me, but in large part, it's just me as a one-man band. I've been able to bring in a lot of playtesters already, and they've definitely been able to, help me expand my vision, really hone it in, and make it the game that it is right now.
Yeah, that's important to have some kind of support for what you're doing as you're in this stage of, exploring what the game can be and what it might be.
Absolutely.
So you talked a little bit about Blades in the Dark, and you talked about Dwarven Forge. Are there any other touchstones in either media or gaming that you want to call out?
So there's kind of two major categories of touchstones that I have for Mountain Home. And the first of which is media about dealing with your neighbors and how they're not necessarily like you. And some of those include the old video game King of Dragon Pass, which can involve dealing with neighboring tribes and other factions who have true, earnest interests, and they aren't just enemies to be slain or factions to trade with. They're real people. And that's also why I've got some kind of strange inspirations in my list as well, such as Deep Space Nine, in which the characters and the cast really just marinate in a space and get to experience it in a lot of depth, and the world building that comes from just inhabiting a place really brings everything to life.
I got a really strong Watership Down kind of a vibe from the game. Somewhere in the back of my head, I was like, I just want to reskin the dwarves as rabbits, and I think you could totally do Watership Down.
I would hate to be in competition with some of the games about rabbits that are already out there today for being so excellent, but I definitely feel you on that vibe.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think it's excellent.
The sea of rabbit games out there.
Yeah, there's 2 or 3 that are really good. The Warren, for example.
Yes. Okay, so that's interesting. When you first think about Blades in the Dark and its ilk, or, its cousins, the Forged in the Dark games, many of them will come across as being grim, and just, you think they might be grimmer than the usual iteration of the game that they're emulating when they create their hack of whatever it is. It's like, oh, well, you used Blades in the Dark, though, so there's going to be some of that, some of that grittiness built in. What I think is interesting is that this game that you're building is decidedly perhaps not that. Could you talk about what other touchstones and inspirations really, drive your decision making?
So the first departure from, Blades in the Dark, for example, and Mountain Home is the relationship that your characters, which I kind of call founders because they've created the settlement, they're decidedly not criminals. Their relationship with the setting is almost exactly reversed. Whereas Blades has you on the underbelly of society, forgotten and abandoned. Mountain Home puts you in a place where your settlement is depending on you. Your Mountain Home needs you. And so I think that sort of foundational behavior for the game creates a sort of earnestness where the dwarves get to deal with each other honestly. They have the same ultimate goals for this place. They want it to succeed. And I think that as I was trying to build this game and trying to figure out, what are dwarves? And one of those big aspects that I think is universal across all, implementations in fiction about dwarves is actually like community and loyalty to each other. To me, that's one of the most common positive aspects of dwarves, and I tried to capture that.
Yeah, and I think you also talk a little bit in the book about honesty, and I think it very much resonates. And certainly, I can't think of anything that would be too much opposite of a scoundrel than somebody who has to take care of a whole settlement for, and all the people in it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a fantastic way to juxtapose to take that idea of, the underdog, scum dog, criminal, whatever you want to call them, and flip that around to the leader of the community. That's a fantastic way to kind of get you thinking right away in a different space than you would normally for these kinds of games.
Absolutely.
Do you feel like in playtesting that gives you an extra amount of buy-in in terms of people's commitment to the setting and to the kind of the premise of the game?
I do, and one of the other things that I've actually done for buy-in is that Mountain Home actually has no single canon setting. So part of Session 0 is the players starting from the ground up and building their world together. And so the whole place is a place that they've created and they believe in and they're enthusiastic about. And so the players believe in this place. They want to create their new mountain home here. The factions that they're dealing with are created with the seeds of their own ideas. And between that and my general intent to remove the sort of defaultism about fantasy ancestries from my game, I think that you can end up with some very interesting, unique places that the players are just delighted in.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever played A Dream Apart. It's a very small indie game about playing a pre-World War II Jewish shtetl. It's got that same sort of flavor of like, you're going to make this community, and then you kind of have implicit buy-in that you're committed to it. I think that's terrific.
I am flattered by the comparison. A Dream Apart is a game that I would love to run, but I've only read.
Yeah, it's a terrific game.
Absolutely.
As you said, you're in playtesting right now. Do you got any super secret plans that you might be holding on to for today's podcast to announce?
So the place that I'm in for Mountain Home right now is that I am trying to get the text polished up, which is not exactly exciting. I think it's in a pretty good place. I'm trying to get to a place where I can maybe afford some interior art. The main thing that I've got on my timeline for the future that I want to add to Mountain Home is probably actually some soloing rules, as well as some new characters for the game that you can play. I'm toying with the idea of actually a non-dwarven playbook where you can experience the settlement as a adopted member of the community.
Okay, so like a 600-page tome instead of the current 300-page. How many pages is it? Goodness.
Mountain Home right now is 213 pages.
I mean, but between that and the playbooks.
Yeah, absolutely. I am one of those designers who wrote the entire text of the playbooks into the rulebook because I want people to be able to play it in all states. So I've put work into the playbook text being entirely in the game book, so you could reproduce that if you need, as well as having printable sheets and an online automated character keeper.
Yeah, that's a lot of work.
Thinking about things that you might add, I was just wondering, you have such a campaign focus in this game. Have you thought about how you might customize the rule set for people who just want to pick it up for a one-shot?
Oh, actually, it's a good thing you mentioned that. So one of the things that Mountain Home has built in is specific instructions for a Session 0, which involves traveling to the mountain, dealing with a first adventure there that kind of sets the stage for the rest of your campaign. And it is one of my goals to take that same structure and provide procedures for a one-shot or a small 2 or 3 session campaign to make players enjoy Mountain Home when they don't necessarily have time for 15 or so sessions, which I think is the sweet spot.
Oh, interesting. So it's really built around that shorter play format then to get you hooked for the longer play?
So I think of Mountain Home as a 10 to 20 session game where each session is generally covering at least a year of time in game. And I think that sort of those 20 years, or let's say 10 to 20 years of time in the mountain home lets you kind of figure out, is this place going to succeed? How is it going to deal with its neighbors? What will we think of it in the future? And I think those are the really interesting questions that mountain home is good for answering.
So you talked a little bit about how it's 1 year is kind of the cycle of play. It's a 1 year cycle of play. And can you talk about what are the phases of play kind of inside of that and how that might be different from what people are used to experiencing with other Forged in the Dark games?
So Mountain Home uses the same bones as most Forged in the Dark games, in which there is sort of a uptime phase. In Blades, it's called the score. In Mountain Home, it's called an expedition. That is mirrored by the settlement phase, which I actually think is sort of the meat of Mountain Home that really adds the meaning to what you're doing.
Yeah, it felt to me a little bit like Band of Blades in that they're both, I don't know if this is a fair assessment, but they both felt to me a little bit like putting an RPG embedded inside of a kind of cooperative board game a little bit. And I don't know if you were thinking explicitly about that or its relationship to Blades, but it very much had that feel to me.
You know, it's actually kind of interesting. One of the main complaints that I hear about people who've read Blades but never played it is that they say it's kind of board gamey. And it's interesting to realize that that's actually a demonstration of trepidation or, you know, maybe disinterest. But I think that both, you know, Band of Blades and Mountain Home do different things to get out of that board gamey feel. One thing that Mountain Home does is you play a founder the whole time. So on an expedition, you are going out there because you are capable and strong and good at your job. But when you're in the settlement phase, you're still that person. You're making a decision about what you're digging. You're doing your downtime actions to engage in your personal goals. You always inhabit that same dwarf. And so I think that that keeps you involved in the story in a way that's less board gamey, if you will.
Yeah, actually, I don't know that I would say that I think it's either one of those are board games, but I think what's nice is you've taken some really good elements in order to create framing that isn't that kind of direct, I'm voicing out what I'm doing sort of play, but instead gives me the ability to span longer time frames and create bigger context. I think it's a strength, really.
And one of those things that I found that does a pretty good, simple job for keeping players inhabiting their characters throughout is Mountain Home rewards XP for participating in scenes that happen during the settlement phase. And so you're always just getting in that natural habit of participating, of seeing each other's characters make choices. And furthermore, Mountain Home has a large number of entanglements that not only challenge the players and help drive their motivations and call them to action, but it also has callbacks that make sure that the GM and the players are using characters in the cast, founders or otherwise, to always keep each other involved.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the entanglements. That does come up in my mind as one thing that seemed a bit unique about your design. We've got mountain entanglements and outsider entanglements. Could you talk a bit about those?
So, mountain entanglements encourage the group to sort of look inward towards their settlement. The entanglements get more dramatic in response to the unhappiness of the settlement or how the dwarves are being challenged or maybe unrest. And these mountain entanglements will create scenes that deal with the dwarves and they make decisions between themselves. They range from maybe disagreements between individual dwarves to having holidays or celebrations. And so these events make the players draw inward, they get more details about their settlement, and they learn about themselves. On the other hand, we have outsider entanglements. And outsider entanglements are probably a little bit more what you'd expect out of Blades, in that they are the outside world responding to your dwarves. And this might be your neighbors calling and coming for help. It might be a faction that you're having a bad relationship with, challenging you on something. It's kind of about testing boundaries, learning about your neighbors, and defining your mountain home within the context of your neighbors.
Well, right. You can upset people, right, and bring more entanglements.
You can.
Can you bring more mountain entanglements?
The general thing that drives mountain entanglements getting more stressful is actually an interaction with a personification of your mountain, a mountain spirit. If you behave in ways that it wouldn't like, or dissatisfy the settlement or disrespect the mountain, that's what's going to fill that clock. And so it does encourage players to try to consider, how will the mountain feel about this? How will the dwarves feel about this?
Gotcha. To be clear, what happens when the clock fills?
Clocks fill and entanglements get more exaggerated. They become a bigger deal. And so a low entanglement for the mountain might be your dwarves finding something interesting underground, or perhaps they get a little upset and start just building in the settlement without your permission. They're acting on their own. As that gets more dramatic, it can get as bad as a revolt. Your dwarves decide that, you aren't acting on behalf of the community anymore. And there's a wide spectrum of events that go from peaceful narrative prompts to true challenges to the founding characters.
I was really intrigued by the entanglement tracks and how they kind of represent the state of either your relationship with neighbors or your relationship with the mountain. I thought that was really intriguing. Can you elaborate on that a little?
One of the things that I think really clicked for me in Blades is the way that John Harper reviewed everything for, is this actually necessary for being tracked? And I decided to take the same approach for settlement building. When I've played games in the past that have tried to manage this, I've bounced off counting how many tons of stone I need to build a wall, and I just wanted to get to the parts that I think really matter to the characters. And so resources like food aren't tracked, but events that challenge your ability to supply food can come up, and that's when food matters. So you might have a entanglement come up that deals with drought, and then suddenly the question is, did we have a well, or are we going to have to beg our neighbors for help? And so Mountain Home addresses these things only from those important moments that come onto screen. And so the entanglement may happen, and then you will ask ourselves, can we weather this resource shortage? But otherwise, those things don't have to come onto screen at all. You can just work on your settlement without having to move points around or count loaves of bread.
I was wondering, you said the expeditions are like a thing, but is this tied to those events, or is it something else?
So expeditions in Mountain Home work fairly similarly to a score in Scum and Villainy or Blades in the Dark, in that it's the players deciding what they want to do. However, a lot of these decisions that come to the dwarves are a result of the entanglement track. For example, if somebody shows up during the entanglements and decides, you know what, your trading isn't a good deal, we are going to just start taking your supplies, that can kind of bring the players into expeditions. The dwarves can't just sit in their mountain and wait for things to happen. There are people acting out in the world, and sometimes they will do things that don't make you happy. If that's subtle, such as people who start using your mines as their own, or if it's dramatic, such as you dig too deep and you find a dragon's lair, suddenly you are going to have to do an expedition to deal with this dragon, whether that is diplomacy to beg the dragon to leave you alone, or something more dramatic. That's up to the players.
And then if I do an expedition and I'm successful or I fail, is that purely a narrative impact, or do you have mechanics that track the impact of that, of the result of that expedition?
So doing an expedition will affect a lot of the mechanisms of the rest of the game. I encourage GMs to be fluid and realistic about it. So if you're dealing with factions, you're changing faction statuses. If you're presenting your mountain home as maybe belligerent or rude, you will just add to this outsider entanglement track, where the events that deal with your settlement from the outside are getting increasingly more and more tense, and it's going to be harder to deal with. The outsiders and mountain tracks kind of work like steam valves, where as the pressure builds, they start making more noise, and then you have to deal with it or suffer the consequences.
So, like, instead of the release valve that you never really get, in Blades, like in Duskwall, it's like meant to keep you in this steaming environment where it's ready to pop, everything's ready to explode. With this, it's more of like a adventure, and then you get to release, right? There's this tension and release, this sort of essential for a longer story, I think.
I think so. I've found that most of my playtests tend to go with this cycle of the players having to loudly and sometimes, confrontationally advocate for themselves in the world, dealing with factions, trying to get their voices heard, but then they also start offending people, but also making friends. And so these expeditions will be both helping their neighbors, securing themselves, and kind of the dwarves trying to reach an equilibrium.
So I think one of the differences between Mountain Home and other Forged in the Dark games generally is the length of time that you can see this game go on. I think you talked about it a little already when you talked about, hey, this is a year per cycle and you expect to see, 10 plus sessions of time. Can you talk a little bit about what your goal was there by giving it such an epic and broad scope and how you see that affect people's experience of the game?
It's kind of an interesting thing, the way that dwarves are one of those fantasy races that just are known for being long-lived. They're always there, they're steady and stoic and just enduring. And that brings this interesting aspect to Mountain Home, where to the individual dwarves, a year passing is truly kind of meaningless. Where, they just know they are going to steadily progress their settlement. They are making this place their own. But on the outside of their settlement, all of these people, maybe these humans or, some gnolls who are trying to build a community, they're frenetically racing around, causing a ruckus. There's a lot of contrast in the way that the dwarves see time as, not necessarily that important, and it just progresses by. But to everyone else, it isn't. And so there's this kind of contradiction about the way that a year passes every time you deal with a settlement turn in Mountain Home.
And what did you design into the game in terms of structures and mechanics to bring that difference out?
So one of the most interesting things that I think, it's a small thing, but in Mountain Home, you can just choose not to have expeditions. And what that means is that it just kicks you back into the settlement phase. And you're going to do that, and another year progresses. And as you do that process, which feels very reasonable and natural to the dwarves as they do it, suddenly time is flying by, and the factions on the surface are going through their faction turns. They're progressing, they're changing the world, and it just highlights this difference in behaviors. And so a lot of the things about Mountain Home deal maybe one level of abstraction above what you'd maybe necessarily think of as the normal procedures in a fantasy game. So when you are injured in Mountain Home, you don't drink potions or bandage yourself. You spend time with your fellow dwarves. You tend to each other. You host meals. You have to engage in the community to become better.
I think that's interesting. It's the case, too, right, that you can have multiple expeditions in a year. Isn't that correct?
Yes. And the way that manifests for the dwarves is it's actually pretty exhausting. The supply that you get through the year, the metrics of endurance that you have, don't refresh for each expedition. They refresh for the year. And so as dwarves, you have to strike a balance between getting everything done that you need and also going back to your settlement and dealing with the cycle of time.
I just want to say, I think that and the kind of the discussion over the last few minutes has been really evocative to me of exactly what I expect a dwarf to be like. That, like, I'm doing my thing and I'm going at it. And what are you guys all doing bugging me? Like, swatting away at flies around you?
I think it's manifests in a pretty interesting way where, as a human, we have this innate understanding that time is very important. And as we play Mountain Home, we know our characters are essentially just burning through it at a pace that we can't handle. And it just feels strange.
Right. I was going to say at the beginning of you describing it, it sounded almost like the dwarves are reactive, but I don't think that's the right way to describe it. It's not that they're reactive so much as just that the world around them is moving faster than they are, right?
I think that's right.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that I try to make that manifest in the game rules is I recommend that faction turns, these decisions that the factions make when they're filling clocks, when they're trying to deal with the world, that they should behave in ways that feel hasty or perhaps irresponsible to the dwarves, because that highlights that sort of difference in values or perception. And not that these people are necessarily being evil or bad or anything, they're just not thinking of things the same way that the players are.
Yeah, I really like the way that you highlight the time passage. The blocks go in big old chunks. 6 months goes by when you just commit yourself to a task in a little way. you know?
Absolutely.
Is there like a favorite scene you have where someone had to pull the community together to pull off their double expedition or something?
So in one of my playtests, I had a group of players that were dwelling kind of near this community of gnolls, who were a religious farming community. They kind of grew close over the years, and there was a lot of trust between the two. And through some of the mountain entanglements, the players learned that a group of dwarves was leaving their original home and coming to the new mountain home to settle it. But the players knew they did not have enough room to keep all of these dwarves. And so they went to the gnolls, and they said, please help us. Can you house our dwarves for us, basically? And the gnolls did not have the space. They didn't have the land to feed them. And so it became this multi-step process of the dwarves having to travel out into the mountains and build aqueducts that could create a farming network for the gnolls such that they can house these people. So it was this interesting moment where the dwarves had to travel very far. They had to secure access to water. They had to build an aqueduct, and they also had to establish this with diplomacy, which really put the dwarves out of their element. It also forced them to deal with factions that the aqueduct was traveling through. And it took, I think it was 2, maybe 3 expeditions. I can't quite recall.
That is super cool. You know, we've been talking so far about this sense of so much going on in the world and how the dwarves have to kind of handle that and prioritize. But at the same time, are there proactive goals that the dwarves have that in the game you're trying to achieve, and how does that manifest?
So Mountain Home's playbooks for the group are described as settlement goals. And so when the group creates their world, they're all tied with an overarching reason to be in this new place. And these range from having to leave their old land, and they are, settling this new place out of need from being driven out from their old home, to perhaps recovering an old lost dwarven city that once was, a glorious metropolis but now fell. And so these group playbooks, the group goals, help the players all have a larger context within which they're working. And so if they were building a famous dwarf trade city back up to its former glory, that drives them to deal with their neighbors in a way that perhaps honors that old lost place.
So you mentioned that there's a kind of a group playbook, and that I assume that represents the settlement. Is it a pretty equivalent to what you would see in a Blades playbook where there's like claims and stuff?
So the claim system is probably the biggest area where the game looks or feels different. In Mountain Home, the claim map starts with just a limited view of the surface world, and it's the dwarves' responsibility to, during the settlement phase, explore underground to figure out what's there. Are there iron veins? Are there caves full of mushrooms that they can farm? And so the downtime, the settlement phase, is filled with exploration and they're crafting buildings. And so instead of having turf, they're exploring. And instead of unlocking things, they're choosing what to build and creating it themselves.
Oh, fantastic. So that's the longer term goal that really, I think, drives the exploration element too, right? It's like, can we explore the edges of this map?
And hopefully not dig too deep.
Yeah, don't make sure you don't hit the dragon den or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a surprise, right? When they're digging, they don't know what they're going to get.
That's right. I've actually built random tables for encountering the world beneath, and so not even the GM necessarily knows what the dwarves will encounter. It's kind of an additional layer of that fun roleplay exercise where you're playing to find out. And so that moment where you discover there's a lost city that you just dug into. Who used to be here? And these questions can really, invigorate a game.
Yeah, and like, is it right next to the other lost city? And now are those two connected? It's the whole emergent story thing that I think that we really want from like a Dwarf Fortress game that we're not going to get. Us role players are not going to get from that. We can make it up. But this allows us to share that with other people in a way that you really could not. If you think about these stories that you make with Dwarf Fortress or any game like that, these like roguelikes, whatever you want to call those family of games have stories that no one else really gets to experience. But here we can share those with each other. And I think that's really fantastic evolution on that story crafting.
Absolutely. As a game master, I really believe in using games to explore the whole group's interest and make every single time we go to the table, I want it to be the whole group's. So that's why I have Mountain Home world building together and playing to find out together.
Were you a fan of those choose your own adventure books?
You know, I actually wasn't. And the reason why I wasn't is I seemed to always flip to the page that kills me for no perceivable reason. And so while I want to explore these spaces, I also feel like that loop of meaningful consequence for your meaningful action is very important.
Well, that's fine. It just seems like there's some of that element here that's like, if you could take Dwarf Fortress and then mix in that plus Blades, entanglement philosophy, you know, like all of that.
Yeah, a lot of the entanglements go into pretty thorough detail about the scenes that they're crafting. So those prompts, I think, help a GM work on the fly to make the scene meaningful. I know that sometimes when I'm playing a game, if I, the game master, get a prompt out of nowhere, it can cause a little bit of panic as I have to work on figuring out what's happening next, and I've tried to strike a balance there.
And what's interesting is that because there's these yearly blocks, too, you could have the session go on and on if you wanted to. You could stay in the year for a long time as you help human affairs or something, right? You know, you're taking part in those little things, those little squabbles they're having.
Yeah, it will tire out the dwarves, but absolutely.
Yeah, it'll tire you out, but yeah, not only that, but then like the GM has this flexibility to like say, okay, the year is not over yet if you don't want it to be, but you're going to be super tired. You know, allow the time to pass. Be a dwarf with us.
Yes.
Right? That's what the game is saying.
So you kind of said the gestational moment for this game, for really getting active in design of this game, was seeing Blades in the Dark and thinking about the Forged in the Dark system. Was there anything in Forged in the Dark that you felt like at the end of the day, hey, this wasn't a good fit and I really had to go outside of the Forged framework to make it work the way that you wanted it to work?
When people ask me about what's different between Mountain Home and Blades, my knee-jerk answer is that it's not actually all that different. Because I feel like Blades has such good bones that to me they look so similar in my own mind. But I think that Mountain Home manifests as sort of a breakdown and rebuilding of the base structure. And so almost all of the parts of the game have been repurposed. But I think that for the most part, the things that didn't stick around were things that were maybe more complex than I felt were necessary, or perhaps spoke of a different genre than Mountain Home does. In particular, I think Harm is this mechanic that speaks to grittily getting the snot beaten out of you, going back to your, clock tower base and, pouring whiskey on your wounds and then drinking the rest of the bottle. It's dark, it's painful, and Mountain Home doesn't need that. And so, Harm, for example, is the system that I've pulled out. I also feel like the way that Blades deals with cohorts didn't feel like a system that reflected actual leadership and cooperation. So that system changed in Mountain Home, where each of the founding dwarves has a guild that they work with. And so these are sort of a smaller group of dwarves that truly believe in the founder's ability for leadership and work with them. And you can leverage them in expeditions to get help. You can leverage them in downtime. And that's also how I've integrated in what in Blades was allies and rivals, where you had these other people in the city, but now these people are in your guild. So you have a person in the guild who believes in you and advocates for you, but you also have another dwarf who maybe questions you. And so that's a mechanism that I use to build a cast of characters so that when we're in the settlement and we're dealing with entanglements or consequences, we always have people that we can name.
And for the guilds, I found the guilds to be a really compelling piece of Mountain Home. And I'm just wondering, what did you do kind of mechanically in order to change it from these like crews that are very troublesome and you have a almost adversarial relationship with into the guilds? You know, was it pretty much just, hey, provide a different narrative framing, or did you have to change their edges and their foils, or like, you know, what did you change there?
So the edges and flaws are different and distinctly less criminal and rambunctious. But one of the other major things that's different is you can leverage your guild in Mountain Home to actually get more dice in your roll much more easily. And so that relationship, I think, is much more healthy with your guild. You're using them to get help and get an advantage just because, you know, that you trust and work with each other. And I think that's kind of a common change that goes throughout Mountain Home.
Yeah, they seem much more helpful, I think, as a result.
That said, leveraging your guild costs supply, which is, you know, the equivalent of using up your inventory in another Forged in the Dark game. And so using your guild brings them along with you on your expedition or leverages them during the settlement phase, but there is a pretty distinct cost where you can't just keep doing it.
Yeah, you know, the more you talk, the more it sounds like it's not just the outer shell of this creation that's different. It's also the soul vessel, I guess. You know, the arcane device in the center with the spirit floating around in there. That part's different than a lot of the games that we're seeing come from this design space.
I think that you may be right. Mountain Home, to me, feels very, you know, it's trying to be trustworthy and honest and earnest about itself. And I think that's one thing that I think the cover art actually captures really well. It's this hopeful view of a mountain currently untouched.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely felt like I want to get in there and I want to go build a settlement in there for sure.
Yeah, like your wife did great. Again, she gets many kudos from me.
I couldn't have done the project without her, both from her patience with this consuming so much of my time and also her art that's gone into the game. She's currently, now that the game's in an ashcan phase, working on giving me some more art to pepper the inside of the book, get the iconography a little bit more thematic, and I think that's one thing that going forward the book's going to be a little bit better at, where the interior layout's a little bit more exciting and matches the tone of the game.
So you talked a little bit about how the game has this extended scope and it's years and years. And when you're in the settlement phase, you play the same person, right? You're a founder when you're on the expedition, you're a founder when you're on the settlement. When you built playbooks, was there anything special that you had to take into account to say, hey, I need this playbook to both work or advance in the expedition phase and in the settlement phase? Or did you find that you didn't need to do that?
There are some playbooks that I think more strongly resemble characters that belong in the settlement phase or belong in the expeditions, but I tried to make sure that all of them can contribute in both cases. So, for example, the Earthshaper is fundamentally a mason. Mm-hmm. That dwarf is the one who is going to be hewing tunnels and building structures out of rock, which is, critical to the act of living underground. But in order to manifest as useful within an expedition, they also have a strong understanding of demolitions, which is a obvious technique that you can use to solve problems in the world.
And did you find that you went into the Earthshaper and that you added playbook advancements that not just advanced their expedition demolition, but also advanced their ability to act in that settlement phase?
Absolutely. I've tried to make every single playbook capable of behaving in both, and it's sometimes just a matter of which advancements you'll choose. As a warden, you can both be sort of a ranger-like dwarf who's capable of helping the dwarves travel long journeys, but also you can keep watch on the settlement and make sure that the place is safe and you can keep an eye on it. And so all of the dwarves have these two sides in a way where you can both help in the settlement and on an expedition.
I think that concept, so much of the rest of role-playing gamedom, let alone Forged in the Dark, is making your character much more competent in what is effectively the expedition phase. The thought that I can also be thinking about, no, that's not what I want to focus on. I want to focus on them advancing in the settlement phase. That's really not something I think I've seen before, and I think it's a really great innovation. I'm really excited by it.
Well, thank you. When I think about stories like The Hobbit, which is obviously a pretty popular story about a bunch of dwarves, their fundamental reason for traveling out in the world is not to adventure. That's not the end goal.
Right.
They want to make a place their home again. And so those dwarves aren't just trying to figure out how to, fight with an axe. They are trying to figure out how to build a place again. And so dwarves need skills for both.
Yeah, I think it's super clear from this conversation that you've put a lot of thought into what does it mean to be a dwarf, and therefore how does that impact games about dwarves. I'm wondering, does your wife have to bug you not to be a dwarf every year for Halloween?
Oh, man. I wish I could grow a good enough beard to become a dwarf for Halloween every year.
The dwarf in me is touched that you put so much effort into understanding us.
One of the other things that I think manifests pretty strongly for Mountain Home being not just a cookie-cutter Blades game is my review of the actions list, where I would say I've de-emphasized specific actions just for dealing with violence. So there are fewer actions named after combat. And additionally, there are fewer social actions that deal with coercion.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the major social actions in Mountain Home is actually called host, as in hosting somebody for dinner. And that action deals with being able to deal with people who are different from you, engaging in good cultural practices, caring for somebody's needs, whether they're emotional or physical. And so that's another way in which the game's focus has changed through its action rating list.
So with so much of this game focused on really what it means to be a dwarf, how do you get players who are coming to your game? What do you put in the game and the rules to get them into that same mindset?
So part of Session 0 involves something that looks a whole lot like Ironsworn's Truths, which goes through and talks about the players, what is the world like to us, for us as dwarves? What is the world like for the people around us? And that process is actually fairly open about what a dwarf is. I don't write rules about all dwarves must have beards, all dwarves are drunk. It's something that the table comes and builds together. And so, dwarves get to be kind of this mutually idealized version of whatever they find is interesting about dwarves. And so between that and deciding their goals, it really becomes their own space.
And did you put that into the XP reward system as well?
So each playbook has a unique way to gain XP that relates to the playbook. So it's kind of did you go along with the theme of your playbook? And that is, the obvious fundamental thing that I think, Blades does really well at. But the other ways that players get XP in the game, I think kind of represent some of the, idealized ways that I think of as dwarfy. So you can actually get XP instead of dealing in desperate actions by protecting others. So taking on other players' consequences gives you XP, as well as being the leader of a group action. So players are encouraged to step to the front, to protect each other, and behave as a cohesive group.
That's excellent.
Yeah, so now we're incentivizing those protect triggers and the lead group action trigger instead of the desperate thing, which in a way, when things were desperate, people would want to get involved anyway, but they weren't getting rewarded for stepping in. If anything, stepping in just made you suffer the same consequence. So it's not really rewarded. It's just something you might want to do in Blades, whereas here it's no, you're getting something for that, You're not just doing that because out of the goodness of your heart.
I do think that both the protect action and taking a desperate action are great moments for characterization where players can justify this in their heads and really express that to the group. But I didn't feel like these, responsible leaders who are trying to care for a settlement and think in the long term. Those aren't the people who are necessarily taking desperate actions to, advance their needs.
It has been my pleasure to bring you this episode to show you this wonderful addition to Forged in the Dark games. If you've gotten this far through the episode, I hope you will have clicked the subscribe button and share this with those that that would enjoy it.
Also, make sure you go check out the Blades in the Dark Discord server. It is a wonderful place, if you're not already there, to go talk with other folks, either about Blades and its games, but also if you're building a hack, there's a wonderful community there of folks who are designing their own hacks and are very happy to talk with you about it.
And I think it's important to mention that you have a community as well behind your game. Where would people go to find out more about you and your game?
You can find Mountain Home at Turtle Hat, that's the creature with the shell, a hat like on your head, .itch.io. And you can find me on Twitter at the Turtle Hat. The general RPG community that I run is RPG Talk, and you can find that at rpg-talk.com if you want to get in touch and just talk games with me.
Fantastic. That paints such a great picture in my mind.
If folks want to get in touch with me, like I said, I design with a group of folks, and we're called Cryptic Cabal. And so you can find our page on itch.io, which has nothing there yet, but will have shortly. You can find us at crypticcabal.itch.io or on Twitter at crypticcabal, all one word.
Looking forward to see what you put out there.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you for taking the time to come talk to us today. I think it's super clear that you've built a game that you've put a ton of thought into how to embody being a group of dwarves in a new settlement and really make that pervasive in an RPG. I'm super excited to do playing of it. It's been a pleasure, everyone here, for us to bring you another episode from Hacked in the Dark. And remember, when it comes to design, we all begin our journey as hacks in the dark.